Thank you, Evie, Professor Blumenberg. Thank you, Maddie, for the mic. And good evening to you all. So tonight's installment of the Housing, Equity, and Community series hones in, as Evie mentioned, on coupling more housing with transit. And for those of us studying urban planning, this is certainly a familiar topic. But there's a lot of interesting and new activity on transit-oriented development, particularly in California and particularly in Los Angeles. Our colleagues here at the UCLA Lewis Center recently released a report, Transit-Oriented Los Angeles, Envisioning an Equitable and Thriving Future, which is supported by LA Metro and ULI, the Urban Land Institute, Los Angeles. The LA Department of City Planning has overseen just over a year of formal activity in their transit-oriented communities, affordable housing incentive program, which was brought about by voter support for Measure JJJ back in 2016. And finally, SB 50 is the second attempt by Senator Scott Wiener to force local jurisdictions to allow apartments to be built in proximity to transit. So this is a lot to talk about and a lot to digest. And to do so, we have four fantastic guests who have agreed to join us and have this discussion with us. Why don't the guests come up now?
Yeah.
Professor Manville, Arthi, Laura. There's a fourth guest on her way, promise.
We have like assigned places.
Why don't you go closest so I can keep an eye on you, because you tend to misbehave. But also you're going next. So I will introduce Dr. Manville first. Professor Manville is an associate professor of urban planning and an affiliated scholar with both the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies and the Institute for Transportation Studies. His research focuses on the relationships between transportation, land use, and public finance. He recently led the study on declining transit ridership in Southern California that some of you may be aware of. To Professor Manville's right is Arthi Varma, who is the Deputy Director of the Citywide Planning Bureau with the LA Department of City Planning, where she manages the Housing Policy Unit tasked with updating and implementing Los Angeles's housing element, and her recent work includes developing local legislation to facilitate affordable housing and housing overall near transit investments. To Arthi's right up here is Laura Raymond, who's the director of the Alliance for Community Transit Los Angeles, a coalition of over 30 local organizations fighting for a more sustainable and equitable LA. Her work and efforts with ACT LA and Build Better LA has resulted in many major policy victories, including passing the aforementioned Measure JJJ, defeating Measure S, and the TOC policy at LA Metro. As I believe on her way is Elizabeth Camacho, I will save her bio for when she's here. And I will turn it over to Professor Manville.
Great. Okay, thank you for. Transit. It's just one way to look at the problem. There are definitely others, and so I'm going to do that, and then very quickly I'm going to summarize some research that the Lewis Center did about sort of development around transit stations in Los Angeles and the Los Angeles area. You can see on the screen that I was joined in that research by a bunch of other co-authors from the Lewis Center. But to jump right into it, I mean, if we're talking about pairing housing with transit, sort of getting more development around our transit centers, then we have two sort of basic issues. One is the situation we're in with transit, and the other is the situation we're in with housing, right? And so our transit systems, I think one way to think about them right now is that we have two of them, right? We have an aspirational transit system, which is the one that we voted for with Measure R and Measure M, which is the system that's going to offer people of lots of different income groups and abilities a way to move around without driving. right? And that's important. It's important for just offering a more sustainable transportation system. It's important for offering more choices to people, and so on. The other transit system is not aspirational. It's the one we have right now. The one that we have right now is primarily a social service. It's a part of our safety net, and it's used overwhelmingly by low-income people, usually low-income people of color, oftentimes disproportionately foreign-born, right? And so you can see sort of the statistics I've put up there: very low median incomes relative to the rest of the county, very low access to private vehicles, et cetera. That basically this is a system right now that is vitally important to a very small share of the county and almost never used by the rest of it. So one of the goals that we have is sort of how do we transition from this very narrowly used system to a more broadly based one that the voters sort of envisioned when they supported measures R and M. On the housing side, right now, to no one's surprise, we have two housing crises, and one of them is not as new as the other. The one that's been going on for a long time is that the Los Angeles region just has a lot of very low income people. And those folks, regardless of the situation in the housing market, have a hard time affording shelter, right? And so the housing assistance we offer to those people right now is inadequate by almost any measure. We don't offer enough subsidy, we don't offer enough vouchers, we don't build enough below market rate housing. And the existing protections we have for sort of vulnerable tenants are either very weak or tend to be under-enforced. That, unfortunately, is not a new situation. That was true in the year 2000, it was true in 1995, it's been true for a long time. The more recent problem we have is a crisis of supply, which is to say that at almost any level of the housing market right now, there's far more demand than there are housing units, and so the housing that is being sold at very high levels relative to the past, or relative to comparable units elsewhere, right? And so this is when people talk about the housing crisis squeezing out the middle class, right? That's what's going on there. And of course, they're sort of two separate issues, but they overlap, because the supply crisis exacerbates the problem for very low income people, because as middle class people are pushed out of traditionally middle class neighborhoods, they start to bid up the price of housing in neighborhoods that used to hold lower income people and so forth, right? So we have these sort of two problems of housing, we have these two transit systems, and I think the policy challenge is how we can resolve both of them, and especially in a way that kind of advances both transit and housing. And one way to think about this is that density can help solve both these problems, right? We know that transit works best in places where density is higher. That's like one of the most foundational pieces of research that we have about transportation and land use. We also know that housing prices are lower on average, right, when you have more density, because more density means more supply. It also tends to mean smaller housing units that just sell for less. So the question we have is, well, how can we increase density around transit, right, through more housing supply, but do so in a way that doesn't hurt the low-income tenants who live there right now, right? Because the key factor is that if you just go in heavy-handed and build a lot of housing, you risk displacing some people who live around transit right now, and those are the people who tend to rely most on transit, right? They're the vulnerable people for whom transit is an absolute necessity, whereas for the rest of us, it is either an option or, frankly, an afterthought. So part of the answer to this, right, and this is what gets into some of the research we've done at the Lewis Center, is that we certainly have to stop doing what we've been doing for decades, right, which is just making it harder and harder to build housing. I mean, we can have a discussion about like the best way to stop doing that, but what this graph basically shows, the black line is the zoned capacity of Los Angeles. That has steadily declined since 1960 as we've turned more and more areas into places that only support detached single-family housing. Right as we were getting down to the sort of nadir of our zone capacity, we started building fixed route rail. That's the backwards way to do things. And so we have this situation now, right, where we have some density in Los Angeles, probably not as much as we need, and also in the wrong places. Right, what this graph basically shows is if you look at where we are dense now, it's where we used to have streetcars. Right, that if you look at places where transit used to be, we have density. If you look at places where we have transit now, we don't. So we have this double problem where in most places we aren't dense enough to support the transit we want to get to the vision of LA we have, and the density that we do have isn't near the transit we're building. So what can we do about it? I'll just really quickly summarize this report that we did, and I'll emphasize that Maddie and Mark Valianatos and Matt Hartzell really did the legwork here. But we chose 7 stations, some of which have transit right now, some of which are slated to get it, and looked at the existing capacity, the existing housing there, the potential to build, and then some scenarios that if we were to build out, how much density could we get? And I think so, I just said that, so I'll hurry through there. 2 very quick, like high-level comments, right? One is just that in most of these places, there is not enough density to support the kind of transit that's slated to arrive, right? If you look at sort of accepted thresholds of density that would make transit work, it's not there. Wilshire, Vermont is probably the exception. I'd add in addition that many places that are sort of nominally dense enough also have a lot of parking, right? And so if you have a lot of density and a lot of parking, that's not transit supported density. And so we don't have the built environment right now to get the transit system that we sort of envision. The other thing that this graph points out is that in a lot of these places, even under the current zoning, there's a lot of what we might call excess capacity. That there are parcels that are zoned for a certain number of units, and what's there right now is less than that. And that we can talk more about that in the discussion. There's a variety of reasons for that. The parking requirements play a role. Also just like the sheer inertia of the development process. I mean, most landowners are not developers and not interested in being developers. The next thing we did is we applied a couple of different scenarios to these stations. Like if we were to build out, where could we get? And I think the big high-level finding here is that you can actually get a reasonable amount of increased density without sort of really dramatic upzoning. And I think the more important takeaway is that we could get a reasonable boost in density without the kind of density that freaks people out. That like a lot of this could be accomplished through sort of 2-story, 3-story, 4-story buildings, sort of missing middle type housing. I think the path we've been going on recently in Southern California of either having very low density detached single family zones or towers has alienated a lot of people against density, and what we tried to show here is that we could make a lot of headway without dramatically altering a lot of neighborhoods. So concluding thoughts are as written. I think that we right now the transit areas we have do not have enough density to really make the transit work. Density alone is not going to unlock the capacity of those areas, although it's an important ingredient. We also have to think about our parking policies. And the final thought being is twofold, that one, if we do this right, we can get more housing near transit and we can make the transit work better, and we can also make the city more affordable. But it's also important to remember that like just building new housing is not going to solve the problems of our most vulnerable residents, right? That poverty crisis that I mentioned at the beginning is not something that housing solves, right? That takes a bunch of money and it takes explicit redistribution, which we have to do more of. So it's important to remember like market rate housing can do a lot of things. It can't do everything, and we have to sort of keep that in mind. And that's all I have to say.
Everyone, thank you. I'm Arthi, Varma. I'm really excited to be here today, partly because I'm also a UCLA alumni, Luskin alumni, so I haven't been back in many years, so I'm really happy to be here. As Mike mentioned, I'm going to talk about the TOC program in the City of Los Angeles, the Transit-Oriented Communities Program, not to be confused with the TOC program at Metro. So a little bit of background. About 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, Angelenos voted to approve Measure JJJ, a ballot initiative, which directed the planning department to create the Transit-Oriented Communities Program, or TOC, the Affordable Housing Incentive Program. For those of you that are familiar with our state density bonus program, SB 1818, you can think of TOC as sort of a super density bonus program. It offers greater density increases with a requirement for greater set aside of affordable housing. It provides these bonuses when you're within a half mile of transit, and that's when you're either a half mile of a major transit stop, including a rail, or the intersection of two bus lines with a headway of 15 minutes or less. One of the intentional things about the TOC program was really looking at targeting deeper levels of affordability. So you'll find a category extremely low income that is part of our TOC program. And this is one of our larger communities where affordable housing has been a real issue. These are communities that are closest at the brink of homelessness and have the highest housing cost burden. They represent about 20% of the city of Los Angeles market, and it's for a family of 4, household income of $30,000 or less. So a really important category of communities to be targeting. So one of the things that we looked at as we approached creating the TOC program was looking at the different types of transit across the city of Los Angeles. We're a really diverse city, both in terms of demographics, but also in terms of housing types and neighborhoods. So when looking at a major transit stop, that can mean something really different in downtown LA as compared to the San Fernando Valley, for example. So what we did was really try to create a program that looks at the differences between the types of transit. So the TOC program has 4 tiers, and it's based on distance from different types of transit stations, and it goes from the intersection of 2 regular buses at the low end to a metro rail station at the highest end. And the levels of intensity that are offered, in addition to the required levels of set aside of affordable housing, vary by these tiers. Talking a little bit about what you get by right. So with the TOC program, you get density, floor area ratio, and parking by right. So for those of you that may not be familiar with those terms, floor area ratio is really your square footage or building envelope. Density is, of course, the number of dwelling units per acre that you are allowed to build. So you get automatic density and FAR increases depending, again, on which tier you're in and how far you are from the transit station. And it goes above the 35%. You can get anywhere from 45% to up to 80% in very limited situations. Parking, you can get half a parking space per unit, and if you're right adjacent to the Metro rail station, there's actually a 0 parking requirement. Again, that's a very limited subset of areas. Similar to density bonus, there's also incentives that are offered, and I think we took some time to think about what lessons we've learned from the density bonus program, having implemented that for over a decade, looking at some of the incentives around open space, height, yards. I think we were really looking at creating a program that was bold, as you could see from some of the density increases, but also really in line with some of our general plan policies around creating development that is compatible. And so you'll see things like for the setbacks, there's no front yard setback deviation that's allowed. So new development that comes in is still maintaining that front yard character. When you're getting additional height next to single family, there's restrictions, and there's also transitional height requirements that are associated with that. So looking at some of our lessons learned over the past several years with some of those incentives. This map, a little bit hard to see, but the yellow dots show the transit-oriented communities projects filed. You can kind of see that they're dispersed throughout the city. Fewer in the San Fernando Valley areas compared to other parts of the city, largely related to the level of opportunity with the transit in that part of the city. And finally, and looking, it's been about 15 months that this program has been in effect. And since that time, we have 13,305 dwelling units that have been submitted as part of this program. Almost 20%, 18% of those are affordable units. About half of those 18% are set aside for extremely low income units. So we're seeing approximately, actually 30% of all of our new housing unit applications for the year of 2018, if you just take January 1st through December 31st, have been through this TOC program. So it's a significant source of new dwelling unit applications for the city of Los Angeles. Again, this is a new program. We're still monitoring and evaluating it. The department has started putting out a quarterly housing progress report where we track these applications coming in. You'll see some mapping similar to the one that I showed. It's available on our website. So we'll continue to be monitoring the program to see how we're doing in meeting our housing goals. So, thank you.
Thank you. That's some very specific information to chew on. I have not introduced our fourth guest, Elizabeth Camacho. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Apologies for being late.
No worries, you were right on time in my estimation. Elizabeth is an attorney and partner at Loeb, where she focuses on land use and development law, permitting, environmental review, and related litigation. She is a member of the Urban Land Institute and frequent speaker at ULI and other regional housing events in Los Angeles. So welcome, Elizabeth. So I'm the moderator, so I get to ask the first few questions, but I do promise to give you some opportunities out there live here in room 2355. And I want to bring in the additional voices down the row here. And I'll start with Laura. What do you think are some of the features or contours of an equitable housing and transportation policy? I know that's something that your organization works constantly on. And how do you contrast what your ambitions and hopes are for particularly the low-income families of this region with what we produce from public policy, either at the local or state level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Laura again, and thanks for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in the discussion. So as Michael introduced me, I'm part of ACT LA, or a coalition with 36 different organizations around the city. So just kind of wanted to back up and talk about why we do the work that we do, and a little bit. I actually brought some slides now. Oh, let's see. So backing up to kind of like where JJJ and the TOC policy came from. So ACT LA, we got together specifically to pass a policy like this. It formed in 2011 as a coalition, and what we were seeing was, Measure R had passed. At the time we didn't have Measure M yet, but Measure R had passed, and the city was really reorienting a lot of its housing goals to be transit-oriented. And developments were coming in to communities where our membership, which are community-based organizations largely around the city, were doing work and organizing with residents, and people were getting concerned that a lot of the buildings that were coming in were unaffordable, not geared towards transit ridership. And so, and there were actually a lot of campaigns going around specific building sites. So, for example, Sage was working on building campaigns around the new Expo line, and buildings in Koreatown and Chinatown. So there was building campaigns, and there was kind of an assessment among a bunch of community organizations that we couldn't keep doing building campaigns, like community benefits agreements on every building. So there was too much going on. The transit build out was going to be massive, and so we should have citywide policy to kind of regulate. And so the kind of idea of doing something like JJJ was born. First, we were looking at doing it through City Council, and then ended up putting it on the ballot instead in 2016. And this was actually the first press conference where we announced Build Better LA. And we have some of our members from Kiwa there, and then also Angela Gaines was one of the proponents of JJJ, and she's actually a single mom who lives with her special needs son. Had a really hard time in LA through moving here and not being able to have affordable housing, and now lives in an affordable unit right by a transit hub, and it's been very transformative to her life, and she was actually a spokesperson for us on the JJJ campaign. And so kind of the impetus behind doing this work was really community members seeing that what was coming in near transit really wasn't they didn't see it as for them, right? And I think that generated a lot of concern about, okay, how is the city developing? Is this really a city for us? As a lot of the residents we work with are extremely low income, very low income families, 2-3 kids, a lot of single moms we work with. And so it's like, where's the development for us? Like and so the idea of JJJ was born. We had a large citywide campaign, a lot of door knocking, a lot of voter outreach. We even were on the trains and buses talking with transit riders and getting them to understand what JJJ was, and just heard story after story of people struggling and their inability to kind of either live near transit or seeing kind of what was coming in near transit, and again this kind of feeling this isn't for us. So one thing we worked on JJJ, it passed, and we just heard kind of like how it's playing out now, and so wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other work. And so this is, we're working on all the community plan updates throughout the city of LA right now. Do it through a Planning for Equity program. We're doing training of trainers, working with community groups on understanding how the community plan updates can impact their neighborhood, how they can use it for equitable aims. And we really see this as like the implementation of JJJ because JJJ it's going to sunset in 8 years, less than 8 years at this point. And this is how we integrate, right, these equitable principles into long-term, like our housing element in the city of LA. And actually, I wanted to mention that the West Side's community plan is going to be coming up, and so people at UCLA should really be getting involved in that. And we have a website and a lot of tools on planningforequity.org, which is ACTLA's website on this program. And then also we're working at LA Metro on the Metro's TOC policy, which passed this past June. And really LA Metro, it's, I think obviously Metro is a countywide agency, and LA City is one city. It's obviously the largest city, but there's 87 other cities and unincorporated LA as well. And as like massive transit investments are coming in, you've got billions of dollars coming in on lines in a lot of cities that have no rent control, no real tenant protections, no inclusionary, no TOC policy. And so we're really trying to kind of get Metro to step into its role as convening and being a force in the county to have these conversations about getting better housing policies in place around the county. And the TOC policy is really our first step into that work, and now we're in an implementation phase, really like figuring out what implementation of the TOC policy is going to look like. And don't have a ton of time, but that's a whole other story, and I'd love to talk more about it. And then one kind of more general comment I wanted to make is our coalition is multi-sectoral. We've got active transportation, labor groups, and we really see this conversation about housing near transit as being critical to pair up with conversations going on about what kind of jobs we're creating with the transit build out. We've got one of our key partners is Jobs from America, and we've been working really closely with them on that question, and also environmental justice groups and other sectors, and so we've intentionally tried to have large convenings like this where we're bringing a lot of different sectors and community members together to talk about these solutions kind of as a holistic approach.
Thank you. I guess one follow-up question is, how do we, what are some of the best ways that we can ensure that this kind of growth and change is more reflects what communities want? I mean, community plan amendments, things like that, they take a lot of time. And so how do we, make sure that new housing, is, more affordable for people that live there, that people are not getting pushed out or displaced as a result of new development? What are some of the best things we could do there?
We have a lot of ideas. So let me think about some of the top asks we've got right now. I mean, obviously this comes down to good organizing and coordination and obviously good policy, right? So it's, for us, it's all about policy change and what we're getting into place. And I think to the question about we've got, our strategies are the ones that I've just talked about, but I think one of the things, both locally and statewide, that we really push is we need to be talking about affordable housing preservation as well, and tenant protections, along with these kind of incentive-based or density bonus programs and production strategies. And one report someone actually just shared with me today was California Housing Partnership's new report about the loss of affordable covenanted units in LA, and we're actually looking at losing about 12,000 covenanted units coming up, and we've already lost 5,000 since 1997. And so it's, we're trying to figure out strategies to build more affordable units, but we're losing so many, and then that, we've also got LSF evictions really taking a big bite into RSO supply in LA, as well as, like Airbnb and other, of course, the city of LA just passed some regulations, but countywide it's still a real issue. And so I think for the preservation and tenant protection conversation is really important, and I think that is one where there tends to be less political will to actually tackle it. I think we see that a lot at the state level, where there's proposals around housing production, but the tenant protections stuff is really hard to move, just as from like an organizing perspective, it's been really, really hard to move. And so I would say that is kind of a top one. And then one other thing I'd mention is we were part of a process around to look at fair housing. So we worked on the City of LA's Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing program, which was really exciting because it was, I think in housing policy, we talked about income levels and targeting for income levels, but AFFH was like an explicitly racial justice approach, and really looking at the history of exclusion and segregation in the city and trying to correct for that. And also, every protected class, really trying to have a strategy on each protected class. And so we were really excited about that process. Obviously, that the promise of that was really because HUD was going to be tying grant funding to cities actually implementing their AFFH strategy, and that is not moving forward right now because of the Trump administration. But hopefully we can figure that out moving forward, because I think those types of really targeted strategies to getting fair housing right in the city are super, super important.
Yes, I agree very much. Elizabeth, what can you talk? We haven't really talked too specifically about what makes it hard to build in Los Angeles. I think Professor Manville set the stage for why additional housing production is an important piece of a larger strategy towards affordability. But what are some of the things that get in the way of someone just putting up a big, beautiful, diverse, transit-oriented development right now?
Sure. Well, there are a lot of obstacles to that. Can you all hear me? I'm sorry. Hello. One of the biggest obstacles certainly is just the high price of land. We are, for the moment at least, stuck with a system where we have very little public money for housing, it's a private system, and land is privately owned and largely owned for investment purposes. And it takes an incredible investment to build something, both because of the high price of land and because of the expense of the development and planning process. It's an incredibly time-consuming, expensive, and risky process. And so the people who are in a position to build are the people who are in a position to make an investment, and those people are looking to make a profit. And so, there are so many things that make it expensive to build, even if you have someone who has the resources to do it. Some of those restrictions are the current zoning limitations. Having the zoning that will allow for a project that will pencil with all of the requirements that may exist, maybe that's a requirement for a certain level of affordable housing, or a prevailing wage requirement, or just like ground floor retail where the market is not really supporting the ground floor retail in that location, or just not enough density to to really bring enough income to support the cost of the land and the cost of the construction and the cost of the permitting process. So we have that sort of built-in challenge of the zoning, and there are a lot of things that make it hard for cities and counties with land use authority to establish that zoning that will support developments that can work. Lots of jurisdictions have very limited planning budgets. It takes a lot of staff work, as I'm sure we all know here, to do a really thoughtful plan that implements the statewide, regional, and local goals. It's difficult, and so even if all we cared about was policy and we could just design the best thing, that takes a long time. It takes a lot of staff time, and many times that's just not available or in the budget. And then there are a lot of political challenges because, frankly, lots of times there is not the political will. You mentioned political will. There oftentimes isn't the political will to provide, sufficient zoning to build the kinds of projects that are feasible or that we need. And sometimes that political will is absent in the decision makers of the legislative body. Sometimes they just have the will, but they can't agree about how to do it. And many times I think that individually they may have good ideas and they may want to implement them, but they feel very constrained politically because of different stakeholder groups and constituencies. Sometimes some of those constituents want a change or they want additional opportunities, but they can't agree on what they are or what the limitations should be, and we just experience a lot of gridlock. And then of course the planning process is challenging. Even if you have a zoning that you can work with, in California any discretionary decision requires compliance with CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act. And that is a very expensive and time-consuming process to go through. It's a complicated law. There are some gray areas. It's constantly changing. There are often uncertainties. You need a lot of staff review time to finish your document. You have out-of-pocket costs for your consultants. And it takes a long time. Meanwhile, you have the carrying costs of land and all of that. And then, the discretionary process is challenging in itself for other reasons, not only because it's a time-consuming process, but because it can allow for decisions that are really not policy-based, and sometimes that are directly contrary to the actual implementation of the zoning regulations that have been put in place by the city or county. Sometimes there are decision makers who are using subjective factors to say, this project is just not really a good fit for the community, and then either denying or downsizing or putting a lot of burdensome conditions. I think that's something that that can happen in some jurisdictions more than others, but there is a real challenge with getting some jurisdictions to implement the zoning regulations that they've actually put into place. And then, in addition to all of that is the risk that you carry. Not only that you won't get your project approved or that it will be approved in a way that puts additional cost burdens on that make your project go upside down, but, litigation challenges. Again, even if you ultimately prevail in court, it is very expensive and very time consuming, and that's a huge risk. So all of these things just add up to, a lot of costs and a lot of challenges. And there are other challenges in certain areas as well, particularly in the coastal zone. We have a lot of additional constraints there, and there's been a real, inability to add housing in those areas. So I guess, those are not all of them, but those are some, and there are a lot.
That does sound like a lot. Being a professor can be complicated, but a developer maybe even more so. we've got lots of localities, just period. There's lots of different zoning regimes that a developer that wants to work across jurisdictional boundaries has to understand to a certain extent. There are a lot of incentives for some jurisdictions to not really make their cities very open to housing development of various kinds, market rate and below market rate. And so fast forward a little bit through this complicated story, and in walks Senator Scott Wiener, in walks SB 827 last year. We now know it as SB 50 if we're still following along, after its predecessor was defeated rather quickly last year, but too much discussion and fanfare. Can you talk us through what the state is trying to do to streamline some of these things, particularly near transit? What are some of the pros and cons of going down that road?
Sure, so the state has largely delegated most of planning and zoning to the local jurisdictions, of course, which makes sense. But the state does have some parameters within state law for how they're supposed to do that and certain standards that they're supposed to adhere to. But I think that more and more, the inability and some of the challenges that I talked about a moment ago at the local level have just gotten to the point where I think many state legislators have felt frustrated, and people who are looking to make change have felt the state level is a good place to either add incentives or requirements or both. And there's been a lot of things that have been tried. So now, with SB 50 and also with its predecessor statute, the way that I look at it is that people are just sort of saying, look, this problem is so bad, we need something really pretty radical. And so, rather than just incentives or, just more guidelines or just more, requirements, which the state largely has a hard time enforcing in terms of, housing element planning requirements, we're actually going to take away some of your discretion at the local level. And we're going to say, for these types of projects that we believe have value, projects near transit, and with SB 50, there's a number of other requirements that are new, some of which I think are still being developed, that these types of projects are going to be allowed, even if that means overriding the local zoning code. And we're gonna allow project applicants to come in under this law if they meet the requirements, and basically bypass the discretion of local decision makers. I think that's a really radical idea in a lot of ways, because we think local control is so important, and I personally agree that it is. But I think that there's sort of a level of frustration that it's in some jurisdictions the sort of unwillingness to even implement, to plan for growth and for housing, or even if you've planned for it, to implement it, where the state feels that it needs to be a little bit more, heavy-handed. I think that SB 827 was, met with a lot of opposition from all corners, and I think that, maybe there wasn't the groundwork ahead of time to try to create the consensus, and I think SB 50 is an effort to create more of that consensus up front. So there are a number of things in SB 50 that are different from its predecessor statute. I think that they're trying to address issues of tenant protections, first of all, trying to make sure that this is not available where you have existing tenants or where you have recently had existing tenants, in order to take away an incentive to use the Ellis Act or other tools to evict people in order to redevelop. It has affordable component required for any project. Then it's not just directed at transit. It is intended to provide this right near transit, but it's also intended to provide additional density and other incentives in what they're calling jobs-rich neighborhoods or communities. And I don't know if we know what those are yet, but I think part of the idea is that we shouldn't just be burdening the areas that have transit with the density. We should spread it out a little bit more. Some of the wealthier communities tend to not have maybe as much public transit, but they have a lot of jobs, and so we should also put some density there. There are a few things that I think this bill is trying to bake in to address some of the problems. But I think the basic idea is the same, to, you know, basically bypass some of the discretion. And the state has tried to do this in other ways to limit the discretion of local decision makers. You know, one of the other tools that's been on the books for a long, long time, of course, is the Housing Accountability Act, which provides that if you have a housing project, which can be a mixed-use project if you have enough housing, and it complies with the local zoning standards that are objective standards, then a jurisdiction can't deny or downsize it unless they make certain public health and safety findings, which are generally pretty hard to make. And that's intended to prevent jurisdictions from using the subjective factors that I think I mentioned earlier about, you know, fit and you know, compatibility and things like that, which I think people are concerned is often a disguise for we just don't want more density, or we don't want more housing, or we don't want change. And that's a tool that, you know, maybe hasn't been used as much as maybe it could be, and it's limited because it only works where you have a project that can comply with all of the zoning regulations. But, you know, this is just another example of the state taking away or limiting the discretion of local decision makers. And one of the things that I think SB 50 does have, at least for certain communities that they think are a little bit more vulnerable or subject to gentrification, is, you know, a delay and maybe an opportunity for the local jurisdiction to do its own planning. And I think that kind of approach makes a lot of sense, where, you know, you have to, if you have an unwilling jurisdiction, or if you have a jurisdiction that just for whatever reason can't gather the political will, there needs to be some, you know, force or some pressure that will sort of spur them to action. And, you know, if you are confronted with a situation where you're going to have to comply with a certain requirement, if you don't do that planning within a shorter period of time, you know, that may be an effective way of doing it, so that we allow the time for local control, but the state is also sending a message saying, if you are not able to put this in place, you know, using, you know, whatever tools make sense to you for your local community, then, you know, you're going to have to comply with this other requirement. I think that, you know, to me, what SB 50 represents in large part is just people sort of feeling fed up, and the crisis is so great that we've just got to do something different. And we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, and you know, that certainly sets up, you know, I want to push a little bit on this idea of local control, you know, particularly in land use, and you know, Arthi, obviously where you sit as a local policymaker and planner, you know, it's, you know, I'm not gonna put you on the spot and say, like, I should devolve her responsibility to the state because Los Angeles is doing great. We're talking about other people right now. But so, does it ever make sense for, can you ever see a city saying, hey, you know what, we're not really doing a great job building housing for enough people, you know, either quietly or not, like say, okay, maybe the state actually could do this better? Is there something special about land use in particular that should be under local control? Again, speaking hypothetically about other cities that are not as amazing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think that, you know, as Elizabeth mentioned, there are a lot of examples where the state has control over how the state grows. I mean, I think there are some very appropriate roles that the state should be playing. I think, you know, you look at some of the legislation that has been passed over the last several years, you know, with SB 743, and looking at how, you know, the state is growing, making decisions saying, you know, we want our cities to sort of not grow in a manner that's, you know, promoting sprawl, but that's really looking at growing near transit and looking at our sustainability goals and our, you know, greenhouse gas emissions at the statewide level, and really looking at, you know, having local cities really do their part in moving towards a development pattern that's going to be more sustainable for the state. So I think there are opportunities where the state really comes in. I think, you know, the state plays a role with RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, where They're really looking to tell cities, this is how much the state is growing, this is how much local regions are growing, and the local COGs are telling their member cities, this is how much you're growing, and you have to plan for them. And I think there's been a lot of attention over the last year about how that process has been playing out over the last few years, and I think that's an important conversation that needs to be had. And I think those are all very appropriate roles for the state to be involved in terms of land use. I think that with some of the more recent legislation that you just talked about, again, City of Los Angeles is very committed. We've been experiencing some of the challenges around affordable housing for quite some time, and have been looking at some of these solutions for a really long time. I think it's challenging at a statewide level to create a program that's really drilling down into some very local development standards in a way that's applicable sort of statewide. I think the City of Los Angeles is sort of a good example. I mentioned in my presentation that we're such a diverse city. We have different communities, and even within LA, sort of having one singular approach is challenging. And we were updating our 35 community plans, as was mentioned, and that process is really about looking at the areas of the city that are actually larger than most cities in the region alone, and developing plans for how those neighborhoods are going to grow. So I think it's challenging to really find a solution that can really work for the diversity of communities that we have out there.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of rack my brain on that question sometimes. In particular, Mike, do you have any thoughts on kind of the ability of the state to kind of particularly a state this large and diverse, to kind of wrestle with the competing demands of vast diversity of places and neighborhoods within and between places, with also feeling like there needs to be a minimum baseline of effort towards producing more housing in more places.
Yeah. Excuse me. I mean, I think that, well, I guess I'll say I'm always a huge supporter of local control on my block. And it's extremely important to me that no one does anything I don't like around me. Beyond that, I'm a pretty vigorous opponent of local control. And I think that describes a lot of people in California. And so, I think local control is a double-edged sword. It's all of us can think of instances where we are, and there are often situations we're most familiar with, where we're like, oh my God, how can people not appreciate how unique this is? Right, and they're just going to come in, these pointy-headed bureaucrats, and ruin this special thing we have. And so people have said that about development, and they've said that about different changes in land use, and they've said that about attempts to integrate schools, and they've said that about attempts to let people of different races live together. Local control is not just the call of people for very good reasons trying to stop bad land use laws. It was also the call of Mississippi in 1968. So we can't just say oh, local control good or local control bad. This really is a sort of case-by-case situation. And I think that California is a very diverse place, and I don't think the state should, I think the state would be taking a big risk if it wandered down a road of saying, oh, well, every community should do this. But I think it can maybe make some progress by coming up with lists of things cities shouldn't do, right? I mean, I think it's a bad idea, for instance, I'm biased in this regard, for any city to have minimum parking requirements, right? There's no social purpose to minimum parking requirements. There are lots of private purposes to minimum parking requirements. They're really good at making sure you have housing, you have parking in your building. They're good at making sure people can't build things near you. They're good at making sure that people who move in sort of have cars. But I mean, I think the joke we sometimes make is that if every city could vote on the minimum parking requirements of the city 2 cities over, we wouldn't have any. Because most people, if they look at them objectively, understand that this is just a way to sort of hurt the environment, restrict density, restrict in-migration, restrict diversity. And I think it would be entirely appropriate for California to say, like, we shouldn't have them. And I think if you look at the history of parking reform, it almost never arises from within localities, right? If you look at sort of places that have put strict restrictions on parking requirements, whether that's Manhattan or Boston or Portland, these were exogenous acts that were forced on them by their states, right? And then we can look at Manhattan and say that, wow, that turned out terribly, but I mean, most people don't. And so I think that it would be, and not to say that I have the answers here, but I think one way to look at it is to say, like, there are some very harmful things cities do in an effort to stop growth. And we don't have to tell them what to replace those policies with, but the state could have a role in just saying they can't do that anymore.
Cool. Is there anything else states should say we should do?
Well, I mean, since you brought it up, we probably shouldn't have single-family zoning.
Okay. I've asked enough questions. I know there's curiosity, there's lived experience, there's knowledge out in the room here in 2355. Fire at us. Not me, I'm just the moderator. I'm not allowed to answer questions. Naveen, start us off.
Thank you for coming, I appreciate the time. I had two questions related to TOC in particular. One is probably primarily for Arthi and Laura with regards to parking. I imagine from Arthi's perspective there's an idea that we want less parking, and perhaps from Laura's perspective, low-income communities who thrive might want some parking. The specific question I had is, was there ever on the table an option to disincent parking, not just incentivize reduction of parking, but penalize the waste of parking? We're in a market rate development class right now. We want to put parking in, even though we're in TOC before, because we want people to live in the building, and that's what everyone else is doing. So I'm wondering if that was ever on the table to take parking away. And the second question is around affordability thresholds and neighborhood preference, and offering extremely low-income families who might be able to qualify under TOC first right of return to their specific neighborhood if they know what the context is for that.
I'll start. So talking about your first question regarding the parking, I mean, it sounds like really was there a conversation around parking maximums and sort of saying you can't park over this limit as part of it. And I think, I mean, parking is a big topic of conversation for development in Los Angeles. I think, having the parking requirements of half a space per unit was sort of a big step. And then really the City Planning Commission, when we went to present the TOC guidelines for their consideration, really recommended the zero parking for those places that are closest to the highest quality transit. I think that was sort of the framework around where the desire was to go with the parking at that time. Some community plans, through their community plan update process, which could be the vehicle to where TOC sort of translates into the future, maybe exploring some of those, so that might be an opportunity for those parking maximums to be considered as we move forward.
Well, I'll just say on parking, I agree. It's a really huge conversation. I think obviously it makes sense to have less parking near transit, but also we need to look at the value that's conferring to developers, and we're proponents of really looking at these opportunities and value capture opportunities and trying to capture value and make sure that value is returned back to the community. And so I think that's, a lot of housing advocates get nervous when we talk about just doing away with parking without capturing that value. So I would just want to put that out there. We should think about capturing that value, making sure it's reflected in community benefits back to the community, because there are so few opportunities we have to really require affordable housing, and that's one tool we have in our toolbox. So just wanted to add that to the discussion.
Mike, did you Want to jump in on
Yeah.
we both have value. I think we have value capture questions.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that like the parking incentive is the way we've set up our laws in California. Really, it's a prominent way to induce people to build affordable housing. I think that it's actually, people do use it, but it's not a great mechanism to induce affordable housing simply because, so in TOC right now, you can get a half space less per unit. So if you're a developer, that could either be worth a lot or nothing, right? Because the way you have to think about it is like, is that reduction of a half space going to get you to a point where, for instance, you have to dig one less subterranean deck, right? Because if it is, then it's worth $1 million, right? But if it just means that you're still building 2 subterranean decks and the bottom deck has like 15 required spaces instead of 20, you've saved no money at all. And that's why, and I haven't looked at TOC, but when we looked at SB 1818 a few years ago, what we found is that most developers, they take the density bonus and not the parking, because the density is like a true, they know they're going to get added value. And the parking is really much more specific to that site. But the other thing I think is that, I mean, so parking requirements are socially harmful, right? And remember, what I'm talking about here is if you say get rid of parking requirements, you're not banning parking. You're just saying that the government doesn't know exactly how much parking everyone has to provide and exactly where. The fact that we put those laws in place has made a more expensive, more automobile-oriented city. And so to say that the only thing that benefits, the only thing that getting rid of that benefits is a developer is wrong. Like, they hurt Los Angeles, right? So when we say like, oh, we can't remove parking requirements unless we get something in return, one thing we'll get in return is just a better city, because the parking requirements are harmful, right? So it's sort of like saying like, when we have parking requirements, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. And it sounds strange to say, I am not going to stop shooting myself in the foot unless I get something back. Like, what you're getting back is that you're no longer shooting yourself in the foot. And so I just think we want, like, there are definitely inducements we can offer to developers and trade, but I think parking requirements are a bad currency for that, right? Because we just don't want them.
Anyone want to push back on that?
Well, I mean, I would just say, there's a lot of ways of looking at that conversation. If you really step back, I mean, from the perspective of like as a organizer that works with communities who feel like they're getting pushed out of the city, right? And there's such little opportunity to be creating units that people can actually afford to live in. We're massively losing affordable units. There's only so many tools we have in our toolbox to do that. I think, creating a city that is inaccessible and unaffordable is also shooting ourselves in the foot. So that, you can look at it that way too. Like we do need to be strategic about how we change our rules and inadvertent outcomes that might create, like undermining the tools that we have to actually get developers to put in affordable units. So that's our perspective on it.
It's a tough problem.
So quick statement on the last part. I think one of the things that's important to remember is that with the TOC, much of the parking can be unbundled. So I think that's actually something that's helpful to developers. So just to push back mildly at that, but I think I generally agree with it. I just want to make a quick comment about Ms. Varma's slide. I was really struck by the huge number of discretionary projects using TOC as opposed to just by right, which as a CEQA lawyer, please nobody hits at me, who represents petitioners who don't like some of those projects, their issue usually is that it doesn't conform with what currently exists in the community under their, whatever the community issues might be locally. I just challenged a project at the administrative level not too far from here on Westwood where the pedestrian-oriented district regulations seemed to me at least to conflict with the project. It was a discretionary project, not because of that, but for another reason. But it seems to me that one of the main issues is to give developers enough incentive to help a project actually pencil out so that they don't have to make them discretionary, which would take away a lot of the CEQA problem right away. And I don't really see us doing that exactly. And or maybe to the extent we do, developers who are saying, great, we get at least this, let's push and see how much more we can get, and we only have to go through the, we only have to assess the CEQA and other litigation risk in order to get that. I'm curious to get any response on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. I think we do see, a certain proportion of the TOC projects trying to utilize the by right approach. But the reality is, some of the projects do need some of those incentives, which are the, relief from some of the existing zoning requirements in order to make the project work out. So, I mean, I think in a world where you're trying to facilitate the projects moving forward in the most expeditious manner, by right is certainly the fastest path. But I think, the TOC program was really sort of modeled off of the density bonus program in terms of how it was structured. And so that incentive program is how the density bonus program is, structured in the city of Los Angeles. I think future, amendments to the density bonus ordinance might consider that approach. But we really, we wanted to, again, sort of be as bold as we could be with the levels of incentives that were being offered, but sort of, in the context of the framework that we're operating in, so.
A quick comment on the parking issue and then a question. On going back to talking about parking and not providing parking, I think it relates very much to the notion of the transit situation being aspirational at this point. And I think that in discussing land use planning and community planning and all the rest, extremes are very dangerous because we lose many people in the conversation and polarize the community. So I think we have to evolve and not go revolution, we have to go evolution, but that's personal opinion.
Can I, before you jump in, can I just respond to that?
Sure.
So I guess we've had parking requirements for so long that it probably seems extreme to get rid of them. But it's not, getting rid of a minimum requirement is not the same as saying you can't have parking, right? Ending a mandate is not the same thing as enacting a ban, right? So if you didn't have parking requirements, and if, as you said, we still have, and I said too, we still have an aspirational transit system, which means that most people, right, will still want to drive, then most developers will still provide some parking, right? As long as you think developers are greedy, right, they will provide some parking. What won't happen, though, is you won't have situations where a parcel suddenly becomes unpencilable because the required parking brings you to a point of discontinuity where the next unit suddenly costs 10 times as much as you could sell it for. So I would agree with you, it would be very extreme and very revolutionary to say Los Angeles will have no more parking. But that's very different from saying Los Angeles will have no more minimum parking requirements.
One of the things I never understand in looking at supply issues, going back to the fact that cities don't build housing, and financing is such a critical piece, and the sources of funding for low-income housing, public housing have pretty much evaporated. No one ever talks about the impact of real estate speculation on the cost of housing. I don't know if other cities have radio advertisements promoting house flipping and the turnover and churning that we see and the houses being purchased and torn down instantly, knocking families out of the ability to buy them because now they've doubled in price instead of an incremental growth, coupled with foreign ownership, empty units, Airbnb, all of those factors. I don't think I've ever seen any effort to quantify what impact that has on our housing supply here.
Yeah, everyone's looking at me.
Moderator.
You're looking at me. Yep, confirmed. You're all looking at me. Well, I think that housing's been an investment. Land has been an investment for a very long time, and so some level of holding land or purchasing land for the purposes of speculation, which may take a few different forms, as I think you just laid out pretty well, has been with us for a long time, and it's with us elsewhere as it's with us here in Los Angeles, but we happen to be, I think Elizabeth probably pointed out most explicitly, the cost of land is very high here. Now, if we're worried about speculation and we're worried about house flipping and we're worried about Airbnb, one solution, or at least one leg of a multi-legged, multi-pronged fight against that is to make those investment returns less sure or less profitable in the long run, right? Competition, for those investments needs to be there. A lot of speculation occurs when we have very scarce resources or scarce supply, right? And so the more that we're restricting supply, I think the more that speculation makes sense. The more that flipping that one house in that one neighborhood is going to get you a big return, because there's not another house down the street that somebody else could flip and put on the market at the same time as you. So I think that's, to me, speculation ties, more towards, incentivizing and allowing more supply than restricting it. But I'm not sure that's, where you were going there. But I mean, quantifying that is very, very hard. Marty.
I would like to ask the panel to comment on the fact that about, maybe 80% of the citizens of Los Angeles think that everything you said is wrong. That homeowners association, neighborhoods association, chambers of commerce, VICA, the Valley Chamber, all want low density preserved, all want neighborhood character to be the way it was, and okay, if you insist that you're going to allow higher density, at the very least you have to quintuple the parking requirement. What can we do to change public attitudes toward this? Are you convinced that all you can do is go to court and get the state legislature to override? Councilman Koretz came out against every measure that would introduce higher density in his district, not because he's unintelligent, but because he's under enormous pressure from his electorate. What can we do to shift public attitudes so that planners and citizens would be more consistent with one another?
Thank goodness he's not looking at me this time. On you go, panel.
No, I mean, I think it's a great question and one we definitely hear a lot. I don't think it's 80% though. I mean, just from my experience, both working on the JJJ campaign and the Measure S campaign, and we did polling, we did a lot of door knocking, phone calling every night, and talked to a lot of Angelenos. With JJJ, we made it clear this was more density around transit with affordability. So, I mean, there is the very NIMBY push in the city. I'm not denying that. I think that exists absolutely, and we're seeing it in very ugly ways around the homelessness, how that's rolling out right now. But I think that there's loud voices, and in our conversations with literally thousands and thousands of Angelenos, I mean, we did hear an openness to development near transit. I think people think it makes sense. Obviously, Measure S was resoundingly defeated. In Measure S, their campaign, they led with that fear of density. We led with affordability, and we won by 70%. So yeah, I mean, I do think though, what we see a lot working with community members, especially low-income community members, is that feeling of who's making the decisions about development in the city and where's our voice, and so that's why we do have to be careful about just stripping away local control. I think people do want a say in their communities, but I've certainly seen openness to density. I think what we hear a lot more is the affordability concerns.
I think you raised a really interesting question. I think, the question is, whose role is it to sort of do that level of education and conversation, and how do we do it? And I know in the planning department, we've been having those conversations. We engage with the community on neighborhood initiatives through our community plan updates, and at a broader level, we have our external affairs department we have these what's called planning 101s, where we try to sort of lay out the groundwork for what is planning, what are we doing, why are we doing it. A lot of people think, why do we have to update our plans? Why do we have to allow more housing? And sort of some of that conversation that you're talking about gets woven into those discussions and, those workshops and that outreach. But, it's going to take a lot of work. We're a large city, and, having that message reach to all parts of our communities is quite a task. And I think, we have organizations from a more traditional planning perspective, like the American Planning Association, that engages in that type of activity as well. But yeah, it's I think it's a really important role that needs to be really heightened.
Nick.
Hi panelists. My question to you is about relationships between the city of LA and the other cities in LA County. The other cities have more people than LA. A lot of them are not well funded, so they have hiring freezes. The city councils are much smaller districts, and therefore, in my experience, it's very hard for the city council members to get behind any kind of housing before you even get to affordability conversations. And so even if you were able, even if ACT LA came to the other cities of LA County, not just LA, Long Beach, and Santa Monica, which have a grassroots presence pushing for things, what will it take to get all 88 cities to act more proactively? We just mentioned homelessness, and it's the same cities often which resist transit. I don't want Metro. I don't want the buses out here after dark. I don't want housing, and those are the same cities that say I don't want homeless services and I don't want homeless people. So we're gonna have the police department or the whomever make it uncomfortable for them to be here and send them on their merry way back to LA. So LA's policies are not perfect, but in a way they're kind of like the receptacle of the other smaller cities mobilizing faster to push people into LA. So what would you say about that pattern, and how would you address it?
Use both sides of the paper if you have to. I think this is not going to be a satisfactory answer. But this goes back to this is why people talk about preemption, right? When you have many atomized local governments who feel that it is in their own interest to sort of repel responsibility, particularly redistributive responsibility, then there is a role for a higher level of government to step in and say no. The state of California has an overriding interest in making sure not only that these people are taken care of, but that the burden of taking care of them is spread over a wide variety of taxpayers. And I think that we have become, not just in California, all over the country, metropolitan areas are mired in these sort of collective action stalemates for exactly this reason. That and the central cities tend to be, the heat sinks who pick up most of the responsibility, and then their taxpayers become resentful of it, right? And so, there is I think in some ways you've restated the case for more state involvement, and I think one thing I would add is that state involvement has to be more than just forcing local governments to do things. One thing that's been noticeably absent in the past few years in housing bills coming from the state is just money, right? And I think when we get to these problems of really disadvantaged populations, we have examples of how to solve these problems or greatly improve them. They usually involve the government spending a lot of money. And until we're willing to do that, I think we're just going to be very disappointed with our anti-poverty policies. It's like we need money.
I would just sort of jump in as, having been a planner and here in City of LA, and then also in other smaller jurisdictions. I think, smaller cities are looking at their concerns and their challenges from their perspective. They're not really looking at it from a regional perspective, because that's not really always their responsibility. And so I think part of the reason you talk about City of LA is, having been sort of the leader in some of this, is because we are such a large city and we have all these microcosms within our city, and so we don't get to act like other cities where we're just looking at one particular area. We're looking at the city as a whole, and so we do have to think more regionally in a lot of ways. A lot of the jobs that we have are regional. We have entertainment that's regional. So I think in many ways we are thinking about things in a different way than other smaller cities have to, given their role and the types of activities that are going on. So I think it's really, smaller cities participate in, regional government associations where some of those conversations can be had. But you're really looking at, different groups of, organizations, cities that have, different priorities and are looking at problems from different perspectives. So I think the more we're able to have those types of conversations where we're bringing folks together and talking from that regional perspective is an opportunity to talk about the role that all cities play in sort of coming together to look at these issues.
Diana.
I want to go back to something Mike said about sort of rather than have the state prescribe things for cities, he'd rather see more sort of prohibitions on things, and your example was the minimum parkings. But I'm wondering, my clients would not be happy about this, but there are other things you can prohibit if we're really talking about how to couple more housing with transit. And I'm thinking specifically about a number of the red line stops in my area that have a gas station literally across the street, empty parking lots or banks nearby. Like literally, those are the closest land uses to fixed rail transit stops. So are any cities, or is the state, or would anyone consider, what are your thoughts about prohibitions on certain land uses within a certain amount of space of a fixed rail transit stop, and having an actual amortization period to deal with the taking issues, but actually forcing more coupling housing with transit? And I realize that's a sort of out there thought that, I didn't say that.
So yeah, we'll contact all your clients tomorrow to.
Hopefully none of them are here.
I think, yeah, like the parking requirements are the one that sprang to mind for me, and I think it's I personally think you have the strongest case because you're not really prescribing a land use, right? You're just saying that the local government shouldn't force any land use to just become sort of mindlessly automobile oriented. But sure, like you can imagine all sorts of things we don't want near transit, right? Like vacant lots, gas stations are a good one. I mentioned earlier that, and I can have Mike talk more about this. We don't really like R1 zoning here at UCLA. It's sort of silly to have a transit stop surrounded by detached single-family homes with nice big yards and so forth. But I think a lot of this goes back to, there's an old idea that is very hard to implement that basically just says if we want to raise money in local governments and have good land use, what we should do is tax the value of land, right, rather than the value of property, right? When you tax property, you sort of make it more expensive to more intensively use land, and it has sort of perverse incentives. And if you go all the way back to Henry George, what he said was, well, you just tax the land value at a very high rate, and that encourages people to build where building should happen, and you wouldn't have vacant lots next to transit stops. You wouldn't have gas stations next to transit stops and things like that. That is also a very out there idea.
Would that also help with speculation?
That would probably eliminate speculation. But of course, like, that's a huge step, right? But I mean, so it's, I think that conceptually, I agree with you completely, which means I probably shouldn't be representing your clients. And, but you know, yeah, the parking requirements just seem like the easy one.
I'll just jump in. For some of our community plans that we have been updating, I mean, we have taken that approach. We, through our South LA community plans, which are one of our most recent updates, through our CPIO, there are some prohibitions on certain types of uses near transit. I think that's a pretty common TOD approach that planners take, so that's definitely out there.
Is there an amortization period for existing land uses under that, or no?
On the South LA community plans, I don't believe have that, but I know that other cities have done that.
Yeah, I have a question. It's like it's typically a third rail issue around what we pay workers that produce housing. So I just have a question, just around what's the changing attitude around prevailing wage now with the cost of a unit of affordable housing now costing close to $500,000. Trying to find ways to drive that cost down or promote off-site construction or some other way that kind of gets around using specific labor pools. So it's an easier barrier to entry for startup developers. Like how's that kind of mindset shifting or perspective shifting towards prevailing wage? That's still a very third rail issue, or is that becoming now on the table for discussion?
I would say it's on the table for discussion. I mean, with the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, the new fund that the linkage fee is holding revenue in now for affordable housing, prevailing wage are tied to those funds. I think having JJJ was, we worked really closely with labor on that and got to meet a lot of laborers, and it really is a serious issue, exploitative wages of construction workers and the way that construction workers can be brought in from out of state, and it's a really serious situation that I was fairly ignorant of before meeting a lot of folks, and so I think it's a serious issue we need to figure out and make sure that the types of jobs we're creating are paying people fair wages and it's a safe environment for them. These are dangerous jobs, so I don't think it should be a third rail issue. I think it's something we need to have front and center when we're talking about development. And it's some of our members are affordable housing developers, and they're trying to make everything pencil. It's a challenge, but it's doable. I mean, people are building these projects with prevailing wage, and so yeah. I think when we're talking about kind of big picture poverty in the city, we need to talk about the types of jobs that are being created, and it's a key way to address the housing crisis is to bring up people's wages.
Dan?
Yeah, with the TOC affordable units, is that adjusted for any units they might be replacing? Like where the units that are torn down, is that adjusted for that?
Yeah, it's still the no net loss requirement applies. Yeah.
Can you say more about the forces in LA that are keeping the minimum parking requirements in place?
The political economy party.
Well, I mean, I think that if you happen to live in a neighborhood, especially if you own property there, but even if you're a tenant there, they seem pretty nifty. Maybe you park on the street and you worry that if new development was to come in, someone would take your street parking space. then it seems sensible to say that anyone who builds something should have to build a bunch of parking on site. Maybe you don't park on the street and you just don't really want denser development to come onto your street. I think it's sort of, I mean, people still do it, but maybe it's not quite as socially acceptable to just say I don't want more neighbors, right? But it is sort of, it's sensible to say, well, I'm just worried about the parking situation, right? And so I think from the perspective of the parcel or the neighborhood, it always looks rational, right? And I think that, as Laura pointed out, we have set up a system where also for some affordable housing advocates, they seem very important. But I think it's a classic example of a situation where once you zoom out from the parcel or the neighborhood, what looks individually rational to everybody there is collectively not rational at all. By forcing parcels to be developed in the way that we want them to be developed when we're looking across the street at them, we end up building a city that doesn't look the way we want it to look. But it's really no one's responsibility to think about that, right? Because when the project is being proposed, everyone is just looking at that parcel, right? So there's never really a huge impetus to say, actually, what we're doing parcel by parcel here is slowly eroding our city. It's making it less affordable. It's making it more automobile-centric. It's undermining our goals with transit. And so it's just a situation where at the time anyone is looking at it, they want more parking. And when they're not looking at it, they're wondering why the city doesn't look the way they prefer it to, but they can't really pin it back to parking.
Can I add something? Councilmember Koretz is working on a motion that has to do with reducing neighborhood TOC conflicts. And he's introducing a motion that basically says, if you are in a TOC building and you're near transit, you're not going to have a car, right? Then you won't need to get a preferential permit in a nearby neighborhood. We have people who buy their permits, they live in condos, apartments, houses, whatever. That's what they do, and they park on their street for whatever reasons. So the hope is that if you build a TOC and your tenants live there and use transit, you won't need parking. Therefore, we're going to say you can't access this preferential parking zone. The experience when the first senior low-income housing was built on Pico near Veteran was that the day after the building filled, the residents there, the seniors, went to the Department of Transportation to request preferential parking permits for the nearby residential streets. Why? Because the assumption was this was a building with 55-year-old seniors who won't drive. And that wasn't exactly true. So they went to the nearby streets, the nearby residents said, wait a minute, we can't even park near our house anymore. This is kind of crazy. So this is one effort at looking at how to kind of reduce the tension. And the other part of it is, I think whenever the city entitles any of these projects, we don't have a track record for how these buildings and their residents live once they're there. Do they drive? Do they take transit but they still have a car? Beats me. I don't know, and I don't think the city knows either. So one of the requirements the city should do is to have a data collection mechanism on all of these projects and look at the data that comes out. You guys can do that.
Well,
so that we learn.
That's interesting. I mean, it seems like a solvable problem in terms of not allowing for in kind of controlling the number of permits that you have. I think I would push back, like, do you want people to ask you how you get around? And, I mean, why would a single family house be any different, that's, I think that. Are you going to try to have the last word here? I'm sorry, we're wrapping up. Is that what you're getting at here, Madeline?
I was going to say, we have final thoughts, and we want to thank our other co-sponsors too.
Okay.
I'll hold my tongue.
All right. So we will discuss in the lobby, perhaps. So thank you all for coming. There are so many different pieces of the puzzle and priorities when it comes to coupling housing with transit. We're talking about two things, but those two things, as you heard tonight, lead to many other considerations. Mike's discussions on parking requirements and the domination of the automobile in this city and others lead us to think about environmental sustainability, thinking about access, who gets to move around and where and how much that costs, and of course what the affordability features of any new housing are for people that when we have such requirements. But all of these things intertwine together, and that's what makes it messy and interesting to study and to talk about. So I want to thank all of my panelists for enriching the discussion today. Please give them a round of applause. And thank you all for coming and hanging out with us this evening. It's been a blast. Thank you.
Can I get a picture of the panel before you guys walk away?
Sure.
Yeah.